Right, I think we're almost there, and maybe just one or two more people joining us. I think we should start. And first of all, to say croeso, welcome. My name is Ruth Hussey. I'm the chair of the advisory board for the Care Inspectorate in Wales, and some of you will know me from my former role as Chief Medical Officer in Wales. Today's session, just a bit of housekeeping first. Today's session will last for approximately 2 hours, and we will have a short break in the middle to stretch our legs. All attendees are muted and with cameras off. However, we welcome reflections and questions, so please put these in the chat throughout the session and in the break when we'll have a chance to go through them and put them to a panel. We have colleagues on hand who will collate them, questions and any reflections you have, and we'll put them to the panel in the session that follows the break. If you have any problems or have any queries about the session, please contact the research team at Social Care Wales, and who will put their email address into the chat now or imminently, and we'll offer you further support if you need it on any of those technical problems. Today's session is being recorded. Recording has started and will be made available for learning and reflection with other colleagues. So that's the housekeeping for today. I think if we've got everybody in, we can make a start. Still a few more people arriving. I think we will make a start. So if we could have the first slide. The purpose of today's event is an opportunity to reflect and learn together from the findings of the Operation Jasmine inquest held between January and March 2021, to consider the changes in the legal frameworks and the ways of working since these terrible events, and to consider whether there is anything further we need to do either in our own personal practice or at an organisational level. The inquest looked into deaths 15 years ago at Myfyrio care home, and that is the investigation that became known, the police investigation, as Operation Jasmine. We were all deeply moved and saddened to listen again to the events of Myfyrio care home, and pictures of some of the people involved in the inquests on the screen, and the tragic circumstances in which these people died. They suffered harm and distress in a place which was their home and where they should have been safe. As part of these inquests, the coroner was exploring the role of state agencies in these deaths, what they knew, who they told, and what action they took to protect people. We know much has changed in how local authorities and health boards and the regulator operate now, and indeed in social care legislation. However, we must never become complacent, and it's essential to continuously listen, learn, and improve. And that's why we're here today, and why we look forward to hearing your thoughts and reflections too. But before that, we will hear from Margaret Rooney, a Deputy Chief Inspector of the Care Inspectorate in Wales, Dave Street, the Acting Chief Executive, Caerphilly County Borough Council, and Claire Aston, Divisional Nurse, Head of Complex Care, and Nairon Bevan University Health Board. All three, Margaret, Dave and Claire, took part in the inquests and will share with you what they heard, the inquests, the outcome of them, and they will reflect on the lessons that arise from them. You can ask questions using the Q&A chat in your Teams call, and we will have a Q&A panel at the end to answer some of your questions. Margaret will do the bulk of the presentation, and I will hand over now to Margaret Rooney to lead us through the inquests and the findings. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, Ruth. Pnawn da pawb, Margaret Rooney ydw I. As Ruth said, my name is Margaret Rooney. I'm a Deputy Chief Inspector for Care Inspectorate Wales. And I'm going to spend some time, so you're probably going to hear a bit from me now for the next maybe 35 or 40 minutes. I'm going to give you a very brief description about what Operation Jasmine was about, and the context within which these events happened. Obviously, the findings from the recent inquests and the lessons arising from them, And then we'll move on to talk about what's changed since then. And perhaps one of the most important parts would be allowing you to ask questions of Dave, Claire and I in the panel, as Ruth has mentioned. Now, we're very aware that some of the things and the details, although I won't be going into great detail about each individual person, but the details you hear may be upsetting or triggering for some people. So you'll notice in the chat that we've put in an address that you might want to use if there is anything that you hear in this session that upsets you. And if you use that email address, a colleague will contact you and try and make sure that you get some support. I think that's very important before we start. I'm also very aware that many of you here that have joined us today may actually know quite a bit about Operation Jasmine, or perhaps you may even have been involved in some way. But there will also be many of us who were not even working in social care or health at the time that these events happened. I myself joined the inspectors in 2013, long after these events occurred. But as Ruth has said, there is so much learning in them. And from my personal experience of listening to the inquests, the learning was deep to really listen again to what happened there. So we felt it was very important that we took this time to revisit them, remind ourselves what happened, and think about if there's anything further we could be doing. And it's not just about how we work together as organisations, but in each of our own personal practice. So I'm going to begin by talking about what Operation Jasmine was, because some people may not be familiar with it. So Operation Jasmine was a name given to a police investigation, and it was a wide-ranging investigation carried out by Gwent Police, and it lasted between 2005 and 2013, looking into the deaths of 63 people, although there were further victims who were still living at that time, and they were living in care homes across South East Wales. Those care homes were owned by a range of providers, but a number of those care homes were operated by Dr. Prana Das, his chief executive called Paul Black, and actually a spider's web of companies that he owned that ran those services. And one of them was called Pertruse Healthcare. Now, what happened with the investigation? Well, the crimes that the police were initially looking at were gross negligence manslaughter or willful neglect. But the CPS concluded that it would be very difficult for them to be able to prove those offences. So in actual fact, the prosecution finally centred on charges of fraud and breach of health and safety legislation. And it was due to go to trial in 2013. However, as a result of injuries sustained during a burglary of his home in 2012, in I think late 2012, Dr. Das was deemed unfit to be tried because he suffered a head injury. And the charges were what is called put on file, which meant that they could be reviewed again if Dr. Das had sufficiently recovered to stand trial. Now, as it happened, that didn't happen, and Dr. Das didn't recover sufficiently to be deemed fit to be tried, and he passed away. I believe it was either late 2020 or early 2021. Now, understandably, the families were very upset and angry that no one was being held to account for what had happened to their loved ones. And the First Minister at that time commissioned the Flynn Review to be undertaken by Dr. Margaret Flynn, who some of you may know. And Dr. Margaret Flynn published her report in 2015. So the review began in 2013, late 2013, and she published her report, which was called In Search of Accountability, in May 2015. And within that report, there were 12 recommendations, some of which were for agencies, some of which were for Welsh Government, some of which were CPS, and one of them were related to inquests, and the recommendation was that inquests should be held. So 4 years later, in 2019, late 2019, the agencies involved were informed that the coroner intended to take forward inquests into the death of 8 people, actually 9 people in fact, but one of those was in Grosvenor Care Home, and one was separated from these 7 we're going to be talking about. We're going to concentrate on today. So those inquests were into the deaths of 7 people. They were held between January and March 2021, and those people lived in Brithdeer Care Home, and Brithdeer Care Home was operated by Dr. Daz. Now, as Ruth has indicated, that as part of those inquests, Article 2 of the European Convention of Human Rights was engaged. Now, what does that mean? Well, what it meant was that the coroner was not only determining how these people had died, but he was also considering to what extent the state agencies had played a role in those residents' deaths. And in these cases, the state agencies involved were Caerphilly Local Health Board, as it was called at the time, Caerphilly County Borough Council, and the regulator, which was called at that time Care Standards Inspectorate Wales, which is now CIW. I think it's important that I say that the people that were in, that the inquests were held for, their deaths occurred between 2002 and 2005. So it is quite some time ago. So I wanted to reiterate that so that you could understand, how long ago this happened. The coroner concluded that 5 of those of the people involved's deaths were contributed to by neglect. And as Ruth has already said, that these inquests were incredibly important, particularly for the families of the deceased, because they had waited such a long time. If you bear in mind that the deaths occurred between 2002 and 2005, and the inquest occurred in January to March 2021. They had waited such a long time for these matters to be explored in public. So that's what Operation Jasmine was about. So that's a little bit of the background. Now, what about the context of what was happening around that time? And the context is important. And I'm going to go through the context, and we may even return to it. And Dave and Claire may even refer to this when they come in. So there was lots of things happening in this period of time. And the first thing that's important to know about is the Care Standards Act. I'm not sure how many of you here will be familiar with the Care Standards Act. I know that all the inspectors from CIW will be very familiar with it. So the Care Standards Act came in April 2002. And it's now gone, the Care Standards Act. We now have the Regulation and Inspection of Social Care Act, but the Care Standards Act set out, particularly for regulation, how services were to be regulated. But in terms of regulation, it aimed to do 2 basic things. The first thing it aimed to do was to create a national regulator, which was called Care Standards Inspectorate Wales. Because prior to 2002, and I'm just going to concentrate on care homes for the moment, care homes were regulated through what were called registration and inspection units. And if it was a residential care home, that was regulated by local authorities, and if it was a nursing home, it was regulated by health boards. So by creating this one single regulator, the Care Standards Act was bringing together all of those registration and inspection units into one authority. The second thing the Act aimed to do was to create or to introduce a set of minimum standards for social care providers. Now, it's true to say that domiciliary care had their own particular set of national minimum standards, but all care homes had one set of national minimum standards which they had to meet. And ultimately what that meant was that regulation was based on monitoring improvements against a minimum standards. And that was an important context for what happened in the Brithdeer situation. The second thing that was happening at that time was that we had In Safe Hands, which was introduced in 2000. And that was the Welsh Assembly Government's at the time's framework for adult protection procedures. And that framework aimed to ensure that there were policies and procedures in place right across Wales to strengthen local adult protection arrangements. And local authorities and social service departments were to play a coordinating role in developing those local policies and procedures. And in the case of Caerphilly, that was the South East Wales policy, and that was published in 2003. So the context of that is that this was a new thing, new sort of adult protection arrangements. It took some time to get the policy and procedures in place. And as you can imagine, it took some time for organisations to learn what that meant for them and how they could work together under those arrangements. The next important point here is about Dr. Daz himself and a new term here called Ymgyrch Limited. And I mentioned earlier on that Dr. Daz, he owned a number of care homes, but he operated them through a spider's web of companies. And Ymgyrch was kind of like a mother company which owned all these companies. So he owned many homes under that company. And the reason for that was because when the National Minimum Standards came in, obviously providers knew that the Care Standards Act was coming. They knew that the minimum standards were coming. And within those minimum standards, there were new requirements around, for example, room sizes, for example, the requirement to have en suites in all bedrooms. So because providers knew they were coming, what happened was that in the period leading up to the Care Standards Act and the period after the Care Standards Act came into being, a number of providers left the market, and other providers in some cases bought up those care homes. And in this case, Dr. Daz bought up a number of services in the Southeast Wales, and as a result, by 2002, his company, so through his various spider's web of companies, he was running 21 care homes. Now, by 2006, all but one of those care homes remained. 15 of them had gone into administration purely because of Dr. Daz's poor financial management. And of the remaining 6, the regulator had closed 5 of them. And so only 1 remained in 2006. Now, the important thing about Dr. Daz was that he was an exceptionally poor provider. He was very highly defensive and obstructive. He refused to acknowledge or accept any criticism, whether that be from the local authority monitoring officers, from health board, or from the regulator. And that made dealing with him quite difficult. Now, another really important context alongside what I've just said is that EMI provision at that time, nursing provision, was in short supply, and there was a shortage of it, not just in Caerphilly, but across the board. Now, under the Care Standards Act, when homes were registered, they were registered with, and some of you may remember this, categories of care. And what that meant was that a care home would be registered, for example, for 40 beds, 30 of which can be for nursing and 10 of which can be for residential. And so the categories of care meant that a care home could only provide what they had been, the category that they'd been registered for. In Caerphilly, there were only 2 care homes that provided what was called EMI nursing care at that time. One was Brithdeer Care Home, and the other one was Holly House, and both of those homes were owned by Dr. Daz. So when you start putting that together with how I've described Dr. Daz as a provider, and put that together with the fact that there was very little provision, and we all know that we try to place people close to their loved ones. Families wanted their loved ones close to them, didn't want to be placed elsewhere. So that meant that with a shortage of places, that it kind of created a bit of a monopoly situation for Dr. Daz. Couple that together with his obstruction and his not accepting regulation at all. Couple that together with a new regulator, new law, new in safe hands. It was creating a context within which some of these things were able to happen. I'm not sure if Dave and Claire may want to come in on this context because I think they were around the time. Now, what else was happening? Well, lots. NHS restructuring. So the NHS was restructuring and moving from local health groups and trusts to local health boards and trusts. So moving from 22 to 7. So all of this change is happening around this time. FNC was introduced in 2004. So what that introduced was further complexity. So the situation of who's responsible for this person? Is it the local authority? Is it the health board? That was further complexity. There was complexity around contractual requirements. So local authorities had contracts with providers, and health boards, so contract arrangements between health boards and care homes, they weren't really as they are now. They were inadequate, and they were based only on provision of nursing care, and they didn't give enough clarity on standards and quality of care. So there was probably a lack of experience in health boards around contract management at that time. And the legal processes for decommissioning care homes meant that a care home had to be given a 6-month period of time to improve. And I think as well, there was probably a fear of litigation and being brought to tribunal, providers bringing commissioners to tribunal over decisions to close homes. And I think probably one of the most important pieces of context, and this is something that still exists today. It's the job we have to do all the time, all of us here. And that was balancing risk of harm. So making decisions which balance the balance of harms of trying to support a care home to remain open for and provide care, good quality care for people who are living there, versus the harm that could be and keeping people in a home that perhaps wasn't providing good quality care, versus moving people who are very, very frail and very quickly. So, for example, Care Inspectorate Wales could go to a magistrate and close a home overnight. But in making a decision like that, you'd have to consider how will that impact on the people living in the home? Where will those people go? How will it impact on their health outcomes? And for example, Holly House, which you remember was the other EMI nursing home in Caerphilly, was eventually closed in 2005. I might get that year wrong. I think it was late 2005, and it was closed urgently because their gas supply was switched off because Dr. Daz wasn't paying his bills. And 10 people from that care home were moved suddenly over a weekend into Brithdia care home. So there was a direct impact on those 10 people, but there was also a direct impact on the remaining people in Brithdia because that meant there was much more people to look after and greater complexity of need. So people at that time, commissioners, the regulator, were dealing with these balanced risks of harm of every decision they made. There was also at that time, as there is now, a drive to get people out of hospital because, number one, it's best for people to be not in hospital. But at that time, the Welsh Assembly government, there was a big drive to reduce delays in transfer of care, and there was additional resources to fund those placements. So there's lots going on at this time. Claire, Dave, did you want to come in and you were there at the time and sort of add some context to what it was like at the time?
Yeah, Margaret, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I suppose the point that I'd make in terms of the two slides that Margaret's put up in terms of context, of course, none of those issues should be seen in isolation of each other. In essence, they're all connected. And I suppose the one thing that I would say from a Caerphilly's point of view is there was a huge desire to get these homes to succeed. So yeah, there were issues, there were significant issues in terms of their failings. But, you know, the immediate approach wasn't around our contract and how could we go to contract default and how could we go to contractual breaks. It wasn't that at all. It was how could we work with these providers and with our partners to actually turn these homes into facilities that did provide care at the right standard, because actually that drive to reduce detox was a significant one. We didn't have the right capacity in the system at the time, and so in essence it isn't a dilemma that's too dissimilar to what we face now, is it? What do you actually do with people who need to come out of hospital if you don't have the right number and the right type of placements for those people to go to? I think the other thing that weighs heavily on Caerphilly, and as Margaret said at the start, this did start all around the start of the new millennium in 2000. Is of course in 1996 we'd had local government reorganisation. In Caerphilly's case, that brought together an element of Gwent and an element of the old Midland Organ, which caused a certain amount of chaos in terms of contractual and commissioning practices. And that was pretty difficult to adhere to. And in addition to that, in its early days, certainly in the first 2 or 3 years of Caerphilly's existence, we had some pretty acute child protection problems. And there's as little doubt that those child protection problems took the focus, they took the resources and indeed the budget which perhaps in an ideal world, some of which would have been directed to adult protection. That simply wasn't the case. The organisation became transfixed by those child protection challenges, and I think there's little doubt that was one of the sort of features that then led us through into some of the difficulties that we had in 2002 beyond. Thank you, Margaret.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Also, to add to the points that Dave has made, I think staffing within the local health group into the local health board for something such as protecting vulnerable adults was absolutely de minimum. It really wasn't given the profile that it is today, and it seems hard to sort of be saying that only, 15 years on from the start of some of this. And child protection always had the majority of the resources, and it's interesting that Dave has just put it in that context. But we are in a different position now with adult protection being seen as important as child protection. But the other thing is the revolving door syndrome, which sort of links on that balancing risk of harm that you talk about. And in my slides that I've done with some of the learning within our organisation and within our teams is, how many times do we go into a sort of escalating concerns, working with the provider, as again Dave has already mentioned, trying to keep that provider functioning safely so that people are receiving the quality of care that we expect them to receive. Then we lessen some of our intentions there and are working with the home, letting them try to manage the situation themselves, only to put them back into that process again. And how many times do we go around that revolving door? We don't have an answer for that, but it is something that I'm continually cognizant with when we're in that situation with our providers these days. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you, Claire. I mean, you made some really excellent points, and as I was preparing for this presentation today, I was thinking, I'm sure I'd be surprised if we don't get questions around, some of these dilemmas are with us today, particularly around, we know there's a current shortage of staff in social care, and care homes can't fill all their places because they don't have enough staff to look after people. Domiciliary care services can't take people. So some of these dilemmas are there. So people on this call would be struggling with these right now. So perhaps something like this event couldn't come at a better time. Okay, so we've talked about the context, and I want to move on now to talk about, so what was care like at Brithdia Care Home? And I want to share with you some of the things that we heard from evidence given at the inquests, and some of the conclusions the coroner came to. So the first thing that we've sort of grouped these into three main bits. There was so much, we had to sort of group them together. So the first thing was about poor culture. That is the first and foremost thing that jumps out when you hear, as I did, I listened to much of the evidence from the inquest, and I heard Paul Black, for example, giving evidence. And the thing that just really jumped out at me was this was about an extremely poor culture, an organisation that had extremely poor culture. Dr. Daz and Paul Black created the environment within which this abuse could happen. That sounds like a big thing to say, but I believe that is true. There was nothing person-centred about the care that was happening at Brithdia. We heard evidence about people talking about just doing shifts. They were just doing a shift, finishing a shift and going home. We heard evidence about things that were done to residents for the enjoyment and entertainment of the staff working there, which were abusive to residents. So there was nothing person-centred about it. Now, I say that, I'm sure there were probably some people who worked there who were who cared deeply about people, but I'm talking about the overarching culture. So I don't want to be unfair to some people who, we did hear evidence of some nurses and some carers who deeply cared about people who were there and were deeply affected by what happened. But the culture overall was not person-centred. And basically the evidence that we heard described a culture in that care home where people were being quite simply just warehoused. and dehumanised. And they were the words that the coroner actually used, warehoused and dehumanised, with even the basic tasks of providing food and fluids not being undertaken to a minimum standard. So it was pretty grim in Bristol Care Home. And it got even worse then when the 10 extra people were moved in. The second sort of area that would describe what was happening there is around staffing. So there were the staffing levels, and there was an over-reliance on agency nurses, but staffing levels in general was a persistent problem. Now, one of the reasons, there was probably many reasons why that was the case. Firstly, there was a shortage of nurses, and I think that's something we all know still exists in social care. But I think as well that the reputation of the home didn't help the situation. And the other issue that we had here was that Dr. Daz and the organisations he ran had a very poor reputation when it came to paying bills. So he didn't pay his bills often. And we heard evidence about that when the home needed staff, so say, for example, if somebody phoned in sick, the local agencies wouldn't give them staff unless the manager went down and paid them in cash before the shift. So that just shows you how dire it was in terms of finances. So staffing was a persistent issue, and the inspectorate and local authorities often went in and found that they were below staff. They also had nurses who had been taken in from South Africa who were living in the care home. So sometimes they would be sleeping at night in the care home in their room, and some carers talked about when they needed help from the nurses, some nurses wouldn't come to help them. So staffing was a persistent problem. There was persistent changes in the registered manager and the responsible individual, and all of those that were put forward did not have the qualifications and were not suitable. Now, that was probably because Dr. Da, well, two reasons. Prior to the Care Standards Act, nursing homes, they didn't need to have a registered manager. They normally had matrons who were nurses. Then the Care Standards Act came and they had to have registered managers, and registered managers needed a certain qualification to be able to register. And part of that was having a management qualification, and many nurses didn't have that. So Dr. Daz, because he didn't believe in regulation and didn't want to put people through training, he always put forward, he would do, if the manager left, he would simply look to the next nurse available, quite literally, and that nurse would then become the interim manager. In some cases, he didn't even tell the nurse. He would tell the regulator. So he was very much about getting the regulator in the local authority office back by ticking boxes. So he'd tell the regulator, so-and-so is the acting manager. And that poor nurse sometimes didn't even know they were the acting manager until the inspector turned up. So there was consistent changes in managers, and the managers that were put forward weren't up to the job. There was also a lack of equipment, particularly for the prevention and treatment of pressure damage. Now, at that time, the inspectorate inspected in a very different way than the way we do now. They undertook 2 inspections every year, at least 2 inspections every year. One was an announced inspection, so they'd tell the providers they were coming, and the other one would be unannounced. Now, we could do more unannounced visits, and indeed the inspector for Myfyrio visited very often unannounced. But when the announced visit would come, the announced inspection, the inspection report would be done after that visit, and that inspection report would compile all of our contact with that service during the year. But what the Dr. Taz was doing, that when we announced the visits, they would move equipment from one home to another, so to make it appear that they had enough equipment. The other area was their practice. So, I mean, practice was the big problem. What do I mean by practice? Well, practically every aspect of practice, but to start with, very poor assessment and care planning. So assessments were just not undertaken. Care plans weren't being updated. They weren't being reviewed, and they weren't even accessible to staff. So the care plans were locked in a trolley in the office. Now, I think that's very indicative of how the management saw the need for care planning and documentation. They saw it as something to keep the local authority and the regulator happy. They didn't see it as living documents. Oh, apologies. I should have signed my phone. They didn't see it as living documents that were driving the care that they're providing. They saw it as something they needed to do to keep the regulator happy. There was shockingly poor record keeping. So what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, there was falsification of records, and that was shown very clearly during the inquest that records were falsified. And there were perfunctory records. So what I mean by perfunctory records is we saw in the daily records, it would say things like all care given, and you could see all care given down every day or every night shift. So how was the next person coming on duty to know what had happened with that person? And this was a nursing home. People had very complex needs and needed some very, expertise nursing delivered to them. But what they were writing was all care given. So very poor record keeping. Staff competence, in particular nurses, was very poor, with little and ineffective training. Now, some of the nurses at the inquest talked about how they didn't know how to deal with pressure damage, didn't know how to deal with peg sites. Now, the experts that were there just couldn't accept that. They couldn't accept, and I'm sure many of you here, all of us wouldn't accept that. The experts would say a nurse is a nurse. A nurse knows that reddening means there's infection and they should know how to deal with that. But the competence levels were very low, and the nursing care was particularly bad. And there was very little training in relation to the promotion of tissue viability and the prevention and treatment of pressure damage. And the only training that was given only happened when the local authority or the inspectorate made them do it. So it goes back to how they saw it as something that had to tick a box. So for example, in the pressure damage area, they did deliver training at one point, but the person that delivered that training subsequently disclosed at the inquest that she had no expertise or much experience in tissue viability herself. So it just demonstrates that the purpose of that was to keep the regulator and the local authority happy, as opposed to actually improving the competence of staff. And there was a severe, I cannot stress enough, the severe lack of monitoring and observation of people during the night time. People that needed pressure relief desperately were just not being turned. And as a result of that, people suffered harm. People were admitted, including some of the people that these inquests were about, or all the people that this inquest were about, were admitted to hospital with appalling pressure damage. The pictures that I have seen during the inquests, I'm not a medically trained person, but will stay with me for a long time. And I know that people who were there who are medically trained, the experts said they had never seen anything like it in their career to date or since. The pressure damage was so severe. Some people were admitted to hospital with infections in their peg sites and subsequently got sepsis. So it was, they really did suffer harm as a result of lack of care. I think one of the things during the inquest when this was all being heard, I was very conscious about was that these people's family were listening to this. And I think it's really important that we hear some of the things that they had to say and some of their voices. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to just show you some of the things that the families said to the coroner and some of the things they said to Margaret Flynn when they were talking to Margaret Flynn as part of the Flynn review. So one of the things they talked about was that there was no activities going on, and that when they went in to visit their loved ones, that they just had children's TV on all day. You know, it goes back to the lack of being person-centered, doesn't it? It was just about putting them into a chair in front of a TV. They talked about their relatives being sedated all day and every day, and I'm sure we all have heard of situations where that can happen as a way of controlling somebody and not having them moving around, making it easier for the staff to do their task-oriented things. I found this one very difficult. You know, that would be very difficult to hear, wouldn't it? To hear someone calling out the need of the toilet and that they were completely ignored. Now, one of the things the families talked about, and I think this gave them a lot of sorrow afterwards because it made them feel very guilty. Some of these families had daughters who were nurses, and they didn't know anything about the pressure damage. So I think they felt very bad that they they may have been able to do something if they'd known about it, but they weren't told about the pressure sores. And I've said already how extensive some of the injuries were. They were, and they couldn't be treated when they were admitted to hospital. As some people talked about, I think this is really poignant, isn't it? That they treated her as though she was without significance, without a history. And some of these people, we heard their histories in the inquest about being minors or dressmakers who had sons and daughters and very full lives. And they were then in Brithdia, where they were being treated as if they didn't have a history or they had no significance. There was a sense that they're only old people, so it doesn't matter much. And finally, why does no one see the grave injustice of my relative paying to be harmed? Very difficult things to hear. And this is only a snapshot of some of the things that families had to say about what happened to their loved ones during that time. And it's important, I think it's really important that when we're, we will talk a lot about the context, and we'll talk a lot about what happened and what's happened since then. But this is about people and their loved ones and what happened to them. And that's why it's important. We felt it's important to bring their voices into this presentation today. Okay, so what were the findings of the inquest? What was the conclusion at the end of it? Well, the first thing that was the most important thing was that neglect was found to have contributed to the death of 5 people. And the coroner found that the level of care provided was, and this is his quote, resolutely below any acceptable standard. And the clinical experts he heard evidence from, of which there were many, explained that this was a situation where residents were simply kept and were being fed and watered, with the bare minimum being done, and then the staff went home. That was that's the central finding of these inquests. But he also found that new legislations and frameworks at that time, which we've talked about in the context, and Dave and Claire have added some more context to that. So the Care Standards Act, new POVA arrangements, local government reorganisation, that they were in their infancy, and the legislation in particular and the POVA arrangements were very unfamiliar to those that were operating them. And that legislation, sometimes not sometimes, always, new legislation, it's difficult to know how you can use legislation or what the parameters of what you can do is until you're actually in a situation. And with the Care Standards Act, there were some deficits in the Care Standards Act which made it quite difficult to take action as quickly as we would have liked as the regulator for certain. And the regulator's actions were hampered by the limitations of the legislation. This is one of the findings of the inquest, both in terms of our ability to refuse registration in the first place and take enforcement action. That was an important finding. The next thing that was a finding was the coroner found that, as we've already described, that there wasn't enough alternative EMI nursing provision available. And that led to Dr. Daz being given too many chances. And Dave talked about, or it was Claire that talked about this, about giving chances, because we do want providers to improve, don't we? Because if they can improve, they can provide good quality care. But the coroner felt in this instance that this provider was given too many chances. He found that the actions of the state agency, so the local authority, the health board and Care Standards Inspectorate Wales, he found that they had worked in good faith and to the best of their abilities to facilitate improvement, but that we were too focused on systems and process, and as a result that we lost sight of the individual residents. Now at that time, because of all the context that we've talked about, when this home would deteriorate, the local authority and health board, quite rightly because they had a duty of care for people, would put in extra support to support the home and make things better. But the actions of the health board and local authority to support that home to improve care, while that was absolutely necessary to protect people, it did make it difficult for action to be taken then to close the home by the regulator, because the home would get slightly better, and then the case would be eroded for the home to be closed. And in the case of Holly House, as an example of that, CSIW attempted to close Holly House in 2004. And in that instance, the Local Authority and Health Board put in extra support to keep people safe. So I don't want people to think I'm saying they did the wrong thing. They had to keep people safe, but that had the impact of just lifting standards slightly. And when we went to tribunal with that closure, CSIW lost the case because there were slight improvements made, even though the tribunal judged that the home was still not meeting minimum standards. Because they had made some improvements, they should be given another chance. And I think that as well then set the precedent that in people's minds that if some improvements were made, that we would be likely not to succeed with a closure. So that sort of created a bit of a vicious circle. The coroner found that the local authority reviews were not undertaken in a timely fashion. That was some of the local authority social service reviews. And he also found that there were definitely missed opportunities. And I would be the first to accept that. There were missed opportunities from the agencies, and he found that agencies should have acted more robustly at an earlier stage to deal with failings, because there was a recognisable pattern that should have been noted in this home. So that's what the findings were. What about how we were working together as partners in partnerships? Now, as I was preparing to give evidence to the inquest on behalf of CIW, because I wasn't around at the time, of course, you'll understand that I needed to familiarise myself with what was happening at the time. And in doing that, I read an awful lot of minutes of POVA meetings, overarching POVA meetings, and you could see in those minutes what was happening in terms of some of the partnership working. And what they showed was that partners seemed to be very unclear about what their roles were in POVA process. And that's probably because it was new and it was still embedding, and they were still trying to learn what their respective roles were. I think sometimes the roles were confused and there was duplication happening. There was a lack of decision making on what action was needed and who was best placed to take that action. So, and sometimes it looked like agencies were looking to each other to take action. Now, some of that was probably due to the fact that of all the contexts we've talked about a monopoly situation, there was very little else provision to go to. So I think in those minutes, you could see that there was a little bit of looking to each other. One of the observations I made from the minutes was that if there was a police officer in the meeting, one of the actions would definitely be that the police should look into this. And then the police would go off and they would start looking into it. And then that would sort of like sit there waiting for the police, because one of the problems was that people didn't want to jeopardize a police investigation. So it would sit there waiting for the police to come back. And invariably, because it's quite difficult for the police to prove neglect, the police would come back and say, oh, we're not taking that case forward. And then by that time, maybe it's gone off the boil a bit. So there was a little bit of wringing of hands and looking to each other for what should happen.
Yeah, sick all night, another water infection.
Excuse me, I can hear someone speaking. Okay.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so that was the partnership working. So what's the learning? That's what we're here to talk about, isn't it? What is the learning from all of this? And I think there's many lessons to be learned, and many of these are just as applicable today as they were then. So the first thing is about the importance of focusing on outcomes for people, what matters to them. And I think what we're saying here is that we must always keep that in our sights. We must always focus on what needs to happen to improve outcomes for people, and avoid getting lost in the process or being distracted by a challenging provider. I know that's very easy to say, but it's really important for us to really focus in on that while we're making decisions. The second thing is about, and this is another difficult one, it's about how do we deal with services with fluctuating performance. Now, I would say, and I think everyone would agree, we shouldn't tolerate services which bounce between poor and adequate. And we must be mindful of not giving providers too many chances. Now, I know that's very difficult because we still have the issue of considering balance of harms. So when we're making our decisions, we should be thinking about, you know, when is the right time to not give any more chances to a provider? That's a really difficult decision, isn't it? But what this case showed us, and the coroner's findings said, we gave them too many chances. So we need to be always mindful that we're not giving providers too many chances. Be curious, get under the skin of things. So some of you here today, I know we've got inspectors here, we have people who maybe do contract monitoring, people who go in and review people. So when we're doing that, when we're respecting services and when we're reviewing people's care, we really need to be curious. So test the accuracy of records to provide the complete picture of care and outcomes. So getting under the skin of things. So just because records say, for example, training has been done, are we seeing that in how staff are operating, or what their competency levels is like? If manual handling training has been done, for example, are we seeing or observing them using appropriate manual handling techniques on the floor? So that's what that lesson is about. It's about being curious. The next one's about training, because training was a big issue in Bristol. And I talked before about where they only really did training, it seemed to me, and I think Claire and Dave would agree, to satisfy the regulator or the local authority or the health board. And delivering training is just not enough, is it? It needs to be effective in improving staff competence. If it's not doing that, then in my mind, it may as well have not happened. The next one is about cultures, being mindful of cultures. I think for me, this is one of the biggest lessons I took away from, I took lots of lessons away from listening to the inquest, but this was a big one for me. We have to be so mindful of the signs of negative cultures and services, and where we see them, we've got to do something about it. Now, I want to reiterate here, I'm not just talking about providers, I'm talking about ourselves also in our own organizations. If we allow, you know, what's our culture like? Have we got a tendency to give too many chances? Have we got a tendency to be more mindful of not having places? Or what's our culture like? And what is the culture like when we walk into care homes or any care service? What is the culture like there? Because if the culture is right, it creates the environment for good things to happen. If the culture is bad, it's going to create the environment for bad things to happen. Sharing information and intelligence. Well, you'll say, well, that's a no-brainer. Of course, we're sharing information. Well, what this showed, these events showed, I'm sure many since, that we will, all of us here, have the clearest picture and the best evidence about what the quality of services are like if we all share information with each other. Now, I think we've got a lot better of that, but I'd be the first to say I think we need to go further. Every day in care homes, we've got inspectors going in inspecting them. How are we sharing that information with local authorities and health boards? We have health visitors, not health visitors, but district nurses going in, local authority staff going in. How well are we sharing that information with them? How fluid is that sharing information? And I think it is something we've got a lot better at, particularly actually during the pandemic. We've got even better at doing that. But that's something we must hold on to and even get better. Working together. So we will achieve the best outcomes for people if we just work together. You know, a problem shared is a problem halved. If we all put our joint force together, and rather than we can achieve much more than we would individually. Now, this one might seem like a strange one. And what am I talking about here? Well, one of the things that I think the coroner noticed, and I certainly noticed when I was trying to prepare for the inquest, was that there was a very poor, and I mentioned it already about the POVA meetings, it was very poor trail of decisions that were taken or decisions that we weren't taken. So it was very difficult to explain why certain decisions were made. Big decisions sometimes, big decisions to lift embargoes or to not issue a notice to cancel registration. Although obviously somebody had talked about that decision and probably made a very rational decision, it was quite difficult to understand why that decision was made. So this lesson learned, I think we all should take this on personally, we must make sure that we keep an audit trail of the decisions we take, and actually also the decisions we don't take, and the rationale for them. Now you might say, Margaret, how can you do that? You know, how can you take decisions about decisions you don't take? Well, what I mean by that is, if you know, if you're in escalating concerns, for example, and it's a situation where it might be one where you might put an embargo on a home, if you decide not to do that, it's important to record why is that not the right thing to do. What's the rationale for that decision? For us as an inspectorate, if we decide we're not going to cancel registration, that we're going to give them another chance, why is that the right thing to do? What's the rationale for that? It's so important so you can explain decisions in years to come. The next one is also one that's about our personal practice, which is about meeting minutes. One of our observations of the meeting minutes was that they were very poorly taken. And it's really important that we make sure meeting minutes of your internal meeting minutes and external meetings are clear, complete and accurate, and that the actions agreed are clearly set out. Because in time to come, somebody may want to look back at those and understand what was said at that meeting, why was that decision taken. Action plans. So action plans are all well and good, aren't they? But if they're not owned by the provider and if they're not met, they're really of little value. So we need to respond when, from a inspector's point of view, one of the things that we have changed since these times, we'll talk about later, is that we don't ask for action plans anymore. We want to see action. That's not because we don't think planning is important. Of course, planning is important, particularly if a home or a service needs to turn itself around. It needs to plan how it's going to do that. But sometimes we need to make sure, we always need to make sure those plans are owned by the provider, that they're not doing it just to keep us off their back. They need to be owned. So we're more interested in action being taken. And escalation and oversight. So there should be well-defined systems to escalate issues up and report to the executive teams. And I can only speak for the inspector at the time, but during this period, the inspectorate did not have a well-defined process of escalating issues up so that difficult decisions could be taken swiftly. And that's a really important thing to have in place so that those decisions can be taken when they need to be taken. I'm going to invite Dave or Claire if you wanted to add anything with the lessons learned, Dave and Claire.
Thank you, Margaret. I think the embarrassing factor for me, listening to the inquest, was the numerous amounts of minutes that were inaccurate. And I know I wanted to cringe at times with that level of inaccuracy in front of not only the families that were present, but also, you know, the learned coroner and so many other professionals. And you know, with my team this morning, I've been quite stroppy with them, for want of a better term, about some of the you know, things that are happening and why we must be so accurate on our things, because of the next time we're in court, we cannot be forgiven for anything that isn't absolutely clear. And that decision making, I really welcome the way you put it on the decisions that you take, but also on the rationale as to why you didn't go down a different route with a different decision, and how you got to that opinion as a collective group of professionals, because we do work in partnership these days, in order to actually decide that route B is not the route to go down. So I think they're really, really key points. And meetings of minutes is a real bugbear of mine, that they do need to be checked, and checked by the person chairing that meeting and other people having the opportunity to also make amendments for them. I think too many times we're rushed and we do not give them the greatest degree of respect that they need.
Thank you, Claire. Dave, did you want to add anything? You're on mute, Dave.
Many thanks, thank you. Going back to the slide before, I suppose, and in terms of this dealing with services with fluctuating performance, we all know what that cycle's like. The problems are identified, statutory services rush in, we see that improvement, we get the home where we need it to be, statutory services are withdrawn, and lo and behold, the circle starts all over again. One of the ways historically we tackled that was by the dreaded embargoes, where we stopped new service, new residents going into a particular home, and certainly one of the criticisms that I recall that always stuck with me quite strongly really was a culture where almost embargoes were going on and off like light switches. That perhaps we were so desperate to get these homes where we needed to be that we were way too ready to lift those embargoes. But equally, as soon as we saw a problem again, we put the embargo back in place. So, we didn't have a consistent way forward. And I think just to sort of echo Claire's point, really, in terms of the whole issue around meeting minutes and audit trail of decisions, we've got to be very, very careful around that. What this did basically is it was an inquest that actually went through in intricate detail records that were 8, 10, 12 years old. And I think the overriding lesson for me personally in that is don't think your fingerprints are ever wiped off them, because they're not. One of the things the coroner's office did was basically sort out people who had left Gofal's employment up to 12 years before and summon them back to give evidence and make statements. So one of the outcomes of that from us, as we did get better of it, and we then found ourselves in 2011 or 2012 in the High Court in Cardiff defending an application for a judicial review to stop us cancelling our contract with the home. And I sat there in wonderment watching high-paid legal officials debating whether our wording of significant concern was less or more significant than significant concerns. And really the whole thing was dwelling on that kind of accuracy of wording. So, what we're talking about here is not easy to do. People will look at your recording, they will look at the way you do the minutes, they look at the language you use in those minutes. But those minutes will be there forever and a day, and you never quite know when they're going to get looked at. Thanks, Margaret.
Thank you, Dave. And I suppose I just want to add to that for anyone listening here. I wouldn't want people to think that Dave, Claire and I, particularly I, are sitting on a high horse thinking, oh, we always get this right. Because I'm going to admit here that after I went to these inquests, I took a good look at myself from when I'm chairing meetings, and I asked myself the question, are you, Margaret, good enough at reviewing those minutes of meetings and making sure that decisions made are clearly articulated within those minutes? And I found myself on a number of occasions, and I'm sure there's some of our own staff here from Care Inspectorate Wales will know that I sometimes write people and say, can we put that in it? I want that recorded and put in a minute and put somewhere so that we can record why we made that decision, because it was so stood out to me, this minute taking, and it's definitely changed my way of doing things since then. So I hope that you guys can learn from that too. Now, all of that sounds very depressing, doesn't it? But let's remember it's a long time ago, and although we still struggle with some of the issues that we've talked about, there has been a lot of changes since then, probably more than we could ever even talk about, because it is 15 to 20 years ago. So it's important for us to think, well, what have those changes been? And the reason why we think it's important to talk about them is because sometimes when you are dealing with some of these changes, you can forget why they came about and why they're so important. So it's important to talk about them so we can understand why it's so important for us to be acting in the way these changes require us to act. So the first thing is, we know that for quite some time there's been a much greater focus on person-centred care and outcomes for people. And that's all to the good. That was articulated very well in the Social Service and Wellbeing Wales Act, which came into force it was 2014. And that act, that provided this new legal framework for improving well-being of people. So the well-being thing came to the fore. And basically, the aim of the act was to transform social services in Wales. Now, alongside the Social Service and Wellbeing Wales Act, which focused on outcomes, prevention, working together, partnership, all those things, was what I like to call its sister act, which is the Registration Inspection of, or Regulation Inspection of Social Care Wales Act, RISCA, which is for short. And that act was certainly informed by some of the learning from Operation Jasmine, alongside other findings from reviews like the Francis Review, Winterbourne Review, etc. That act certainly represented a step change in how we as a regulator regulate adult and children's services, because it places people right at the centre of regulation. And it focuses on their personal outcomes and what matters to them. So all the regulations under RISCA are outcome focused regulations. And that's very helpful to us as a regulator. That the RISCA brought with it an entirely new model of regulation, which if we had had it at the time, it would have given us much stronger powers. So it gives us the flexibility to take action when things go wrong at the appropriate level. So what I mean by that is we can now cancel the parts of a service provider's registration that may be consistently non-compliant, or we can cancel the entire registration of the provider where those failings are systemic across all of or a number of their services. So if we'd had this act at the time, we would have been able to close a number of Dr. Daz's homes at the same time, although he would have challenged us, of course, which was his right, but we would have been able to do that. And that now enables us to take swifter action and stronger action when it's needed. RISCA addresses one of the other points that was brought forward in the Flynn review, which was about accountability. Margaret Flynn talked about that there was no accountability for providers. So as part of RISCA, one of the aims was to place accountability for the quality of care firmly at the very highest level within provider organisations. And that's achieved through the responsible individual role, which was not a new role, but the responsible individual role now must be at director level. And the responsible individual is accountable for compliance and service quality. Under the Care Standards Act, it was all too easy for providers and responsible individuals for the finger of blame to come out and point towards the registered manager. So registered managers often became the fall guys for when things were going wrong, when often they weren't being given the resources that they needed or the support they needed to run the service as well. Under RISCA, responsible individuals have got specific legal duties, some of which are offences if they don't meet those requirements. And that's very helpful to us. There's also more in RISCA which helps us focus on securing improvement in the quality of care and support. And we've got increased powers around that to facilitate improvement through improvement notices. Now they're important because under the Care Standards Act, we only really had one course of action, really, which was to close the service. And then you all those other things to think about if you're closing a service. Whereas now under RISCA, we have improvement notices, which is statutory notice to make them get better as such before we move to closing them. So adult protection, well, adult safeguarding has developed considerably since these events happened. That's principally because of those processes becoming more understood and agencies becoming more experienced in that area, and also the Social Service and Wellbeing Wales Act has now placed adult safeguarding on a statutory footing, similar to that of safeguarding children, including a duty to report adults at risk, arrangements around assessment and care and support planning for adults at risk, and of course it introduced the regional safeguarding adult boards and the national independent safeguarding boards. So we're all much more practiced and experienced in adult safeguarding. When these events happened, there was a lot of work done. So we're here today to learn lessons together and think about the lessons, but a lot of reflection was done at the time as well. So following the events of Operation Jasmine, there was a lot of work done to learn and to come together as agencies to ensure that those lessons were never lost and that they would never be forgotten. One of the other big changes, which was very beneficial now, is the escalating concerns process. And although I'd be the first to admit that this probably now is due for review at this stage, because it's a long time ago since it came in, it did represent a step change in how partners respond and work together when dealing with escalating concerns and impending home closures. And that was very beneficial. And that set out how agencies can discharge their own statutory responsibilities while working together in these types of circumstances. I think if we'd had that at the time, it might have been helpful to us in this particular scenario. And one of the other important changes is new ways of working. So all of us, all agencies, have changed not just how we work together, but also our own internal ways of working. So from Care Inspectorate Wales' point of view, we have fundamentally changed our approach to how we do regulation, and we were very assisted in that by RISCA. So now, for us, we place people's experience at the heart of regulation. So we're focusing on the extent to which people's wellbeing outcomes are being met, and we're making judgments about that. Our inspection reports are being substantially simplified. During the period of these events, I had to read, I think it was 6 inspection reports that were in relation to Bristier, and each of those inspection reports were about 60 pages long and very technical, with reams and reams of requirements, and it was very difficult to sort the wheat from the chaff. It was very difficult to sort of get to what are the important things that we need to know about this home. So our inspection reports have been substantially simplified, and whilst providers and professionals like yourselves here today, you will want to read our reports, they are written primarily for the general public to enable people to have a concise and good understanding of what the quality of care being provided is. We've moved away, I've talked this before, we've moved away from using requirements and action plans to using priority action notices. In other words, we want to see action happening. We introduced a process of dealing with concerns, because in the Bristier instance, some people raised concerns, in particular an agency nurse who raised a lot of concerns. And I don't think we at the time had a proper process in place for dealing with those and making sure it was all brought together into a coherent story. But we do have that now. And most importantly, we've introduced a very structured and staged enforcement pathway with systems and templates for recording decisions. And that helps us ensure that when there are care failings, which are not being addressed by the provider, that we can escalate them quickly and action can be taken to enforce improvements or to prevent the provider from continuing to operate. Now, we've made lots of other changes in our structure. So we're restructured since then into national teams with expertise around inspection, teams with expertise around enforcement, which helps us to be more consistent. I've talked about some of the ways that our ways of working have changed, but I'm sure that Claire and Dave will want to come in and talk about some of further changes that maybe are relevant to their areas.
Yes, thank you. Happy to do that now if that's appropriate. And I think for our organisation and the work that we did with Margaret Flynn and some of the family representatives, it made us really think much more about our key performance indicators that we were collecting. So it's very good collecting these things. What were we doing with that information, and were we really interrogating it? But it also gave us an opportunity to look at how our teams were structured and put in requests for, with a very clear rationale as to why we actually needed more people to do some of this work. So instead of having one nurse for a locality and doing everything, we're now structured with a team of governance nurses that work within each of the 5 localities that we're covering across the Aneurin and Bevan Health Board. So that's the 5 local authority areas. So we have a small team. We're also much better at looking at the trend information from those key performance indicators that we collect. So around pressure ulcers, falls, infections, admissions to hospitals, those sorts of things, any datexes that are perhaps, which is our incident information system that is recorded when a person is admitted to hospital and what we know about it, information from local GPs, from our district nursing colleagues, a plethora of other individuals in professional roles, and sometimes from our community dental service, which do actually give us some really good insights when they visit the homes, and certainly around mouth care and dental care. And that's been really, really helpful. And it's knowing that any professional and any visiting person to a home can actually raise a concern, and not ignoring that and making sure that we follow it through. And sometimes it is a matter of having that conversation, and other times it needs much more detailed work and a real concerted team and partner effort. We also look at safeguarding referrals, as you would expect me to say, and medication audits are very, very important for us as well. And we bring all this information together through the lens of the governance nurses and the senior nurses in the locality. And then that information gets shared within our division, and also through any formal processes that we may be going through. I'll probably stop there, Margaret, if I may, because there's an awful lot that I could go on, but happy to take questions in more detail when we get to the questions point. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire.
Thanks, Margaret. Yeah, a few things from me. I think firstly, the big one is joint working. It's not that there wasn't joint working before, of course there was, but I think it's fair to say there were tensions in terms of, well, actually whose role is it now to take this to the next stage? I can remember some long and difficult discussions in terms of, in terms of a particular home that we know of who was failing. Should it be the local authority that cancelled the contract, or should it be CIW who actually cancelled the registration for the home? And that discussion probably went on much longer than it should have in hindsight, and I'm sure wouldn't take anywhere near that amount of time at the moment. Of course, against that adult safeguarding agenda, we've got the emergence of the adult safeguarding board, adult safeguarding boards, and the national safeguarding boards, and they've been really helpful. In terms of those learning lessons, one of the things that came out of the work that South Wales Police were doing around Operation Jasmine, colleagues in Gwent, was they developed a document called 106 Lessons Learned. That document is available. If you want to go and find it, you can find it. It's in both Dr. Flynn's report, and I believe it's in the coroner's report as well. And certainly, we took that document very, very seriously. Myself and the service manager for protecting vulnerable adults in Gofal at the time sort of touted that document across Wales and indeed into England. So that was very much the architecture, if you like, for us in Gofal, recognising there were significant failings and really wanting to share that learning, not just in Gofal, not just in Gwent or South Wales, but on much more of a national perspective. Ironically, one of the things the emergence of Operation Jasmine did was it focused our corporate colleagues into some of the risks that the council was facing. And as a consequence of that was a real driver for us being able to get resources into this area. A little bit like Claire said a little earlier, at the start of this journey, we didn't have a lot. We had one senior manager responsible for protecting vulnerable adults and commissioning, and a couple of contract monitoring staff. And it really was only as corporate colleagues began to understand the sort of scope of those lessons learned and the risks to the authority of not doing anything that we then began to get a level of funding which allowed us to resource this much more significantly than we would have been able to previously. So it seems a little almost wrong to talk about positives coming out of Operation Jasmine, but certainly in terms of focusing people's minds who perhaps previously wouldn't have seen this as an issue for them, it was hugely important. I think that's all I need to say at this point.
Thank you very much, Dave. That's really useful. So, Ruth, that brings us to the end of our presentation.
Thank you very much indeed, all three of you. And that's harrowing to listen to, but hugely important that we spend some time. But let's take a few minutes break and we'll come back to the discussion.
Okay. Shall we come back at 3:30?
Yes, 3:30, and we've got lots of questions coming in.
Looking forward to it.
I'd encourage others to just reflect on what you've heard and pop your questions in. We'll try and get through as many as possible in the time that we've got left. See you shortly at 3:30.
Margaret, it's Sally. Just
Welcome back. It's 3:30. It's now time to move into the panel discussion. I'm pleased to see we've got lots of questions in the chat, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. There's some really important points being made there. Just before we go to the questions, just some reflections which we might use as part of our answers to other questions as well. But we've had a reflection, the accountability for RIs, it has not been fully understood by providers as yet. Another comment from an LA perspective, there's a balancing act in managing staff resources to cope with new referrals for those who haven't any services, alongside the yearly reviews for those who receive care, and a sort of perception that if people are in a care home, they're safe and perhaps of a lesser priority. Important that we recognise the importance of those reviews in terms of quality assuring care, so not to forget those people who are already in receipt of care. And then a worrying comment, joint working has improved, but difficulties still encountered. And, you know, my reflection on what I've heard and the sort of improvements that have been made so far is that the systems have changed. The ability to create a stronger environment for people to act is there. However, you know, as we heard in the tragic circumstances, leadership, recognising our role as individuals, and being willing to take on very difficult things when there's so many other pressing issues on our time as well. So it's understandable. So the system generally is trying to make it easier to do the right thing, but you know, sometimes it isn't always that easy. So time to reflect, but let's go through some of the questions. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of the questions. We have them very early on. So some of the questions are factual, but also give us a chance to reflect on those. So first question, what was the involvement of GPs with regards to monitoring the patients and the sedation, and presumably who was prescribing and monitoring that prescribing? So Margaret, is that you or Claire?
Happy to go with it, Ruth. The fact is that the Dazzers, Mr. and Mrs. were actually both two local GPs who were monitoring and prescribing for those care homes. We've all got a wry smile on our face, but it's really around that very serious nature and that conflict of interest. And that was very much considered in Margaret Flynn's report around should that be allowed going forward. And she had very, very strong views about that, which she wanted to present back into Welsh Government.
Reassure me that if doctors own nursing homes, that they can't also be the patient's doctor. Can that happen still now?
No.
Just to add to Claire's answer, in RISCA, one of the things that was put in there was around those conflicts of interest. So that we now have something we can hook it on to say you can't be someone's doctor, you can't be their GP and also run a care home. One of the things I would say is that sometimes when law is made, providers and people in general, I don't want this to sound like provider bashing. We've got some really good providers in Wales, but sometimes people instantly try and find a way around it. So we're always having to be vigilant of that.
Yeah, human nature, I'm afraid.
Yes.
Okay, let's get through as many questions as we can. Why do Care Inspectorate Wales abstain from the decision to impose suspension on placements, citing that it's a local authority decision?
Well, my answer to that question would be that we shouldn't be. If a care home is failing and people are suffering poor outcomes, then I will always say we should take action. So if that's happening, and you know, we as an inspectorate and all of us here should be open to hearing things like this from our partners. And if that's happening, we would want to know about it and do something about it. Because if, as I've said, if care homes are failing, we should be taking action.
I think Dave mentioned earlier, I'm not sure whether Dave's come back, but I think he mentioned sometimes it's not clear who should take the action. And again, it's an example of somebody has to, and not letting that process drag on if it's a grey area decision.
Yeah, and I think one of the things here, Ruth, is certainly as senior managers, but having the courage of conviction. I think one of the things I learned, the hard way to a degree, is to an extent you can't but nobody will cut you any slack because you waited for the right body to make the right decision. Sometimes you've just got to make that decision yourself. And if you can have those difficult conversations, you have them after you've made the decision and not before.
And make sure you've written down the why you've done it and what you decided to do. Absolutely.
If I may add on that, I don't think we were always clear as to whether we want the inspection colleagues to be part of that decision making with us or not. But my more recent experience is that they are side by side with us again in those forums. We did go through a little bit of a period, probably as Risca was coming in, and a slight reorganisation, I think, Mark, within your services.
Yes.
And that, for me, is where we had some gaps, but it has improved.
Thank you. So a factual question, are the offences under Risca criminal? What does this mean and how would it be undertaken?
Yes, so offences under Risca are criminal. A lot of them are criminal. And what that means is that when somebody breaches those regulations, we have an option. We can use our civil powers, that is taking away registration, restricting admissions, placing other conditions on registration, or we could take them forward and prosecute. If we wanted to prosecute, we would have to get agreement to do that because it would be the Welsh Government prosecuting from the Council General. And then he would have to apply the test of, is it the public interest? Is there enough evidence? So that's, all offences are criminal offences.
Thank you. So do you think there are now enough consequences for providers where there are poor standards of care? For example, you've mentioned that the non-compliance notices can be in place, but they can be in place for years with no improvements or repeated risk reports and not always clear about the processes. So is that enough? Or, if there are lower level issues, are there enough powers, if you like, enough consequences there?
I from my professional opinion, feel that we can't just expect the RIs to know these things. So within our locality areas where we have concerns, we do call the RIs in, and often that's Dave and I, if it's been in the Caerphilly area or other equivalent, team members. And actually, we do want to look those RIs in the eye and tell them that this is their responsibility. It is on their watch. These are the things that we can do to support them. But overarching, it is their responsibility. And even, very recently, we've been doing that. So I think we have to communicate very clearly our expectations, as well as they should know it. But we do need to do that communication, Ruth.
Okay, thank you.
I think I would add to that, Ruth, that all of us here, we do have to be proportionate. So when if any of us walked into a care home, we're probably going to find something that's not the way we'd want it to be. Now, we now have a risk matrix that we use to try and help us determine how we respond to that. So I can hear some feedback, Ruth. Can you hear that?
Yes. Can everybody make sure they're on mute, please?
So we have to respond appropriately. So we do have a risk matrix. Now, if I knew that there was a service that had non-compliance on for many years, I'd want to know about that service, because if it's there for many years, then we should be escalating that up and doing something about it.
Thank you. We talked earlier about the current situation and the pressure on homes, care providers, given the staffing challenges that they face. There's a question here. As we develop our market stability report, there's some very clear messages from providers about the complexity of needs of people that we're expecting them to support. Is it time to review our model of care and expectations we put on providers? Is that Claire, maybe?
Yeah, yes, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with looking at the models of care, but we must remember that before they agree to admit a particular individual to a care home as part of regulation and the requirements, a care home has to agree that they can meet the needs of that individual. And we all know that people deteriorate, but they need to come back to, if we are commissioning or the local authority, they need to be communicating with us those levels of deterioration. And again, you know, time and time again, we do reiterate that. I think the model of care is a bigger thing than this meeting, and is something that we're probably all struggling with as we go forward and out of the pandemic, through into what we need in the future. So Dave may want to come back in on that, because we've battled on this with the Regional Partnership Board.
We have and a regional commissioning group and a national commissioning board and lots of other meetings I go to, and I think, you know, it is almost a standard phrase now, isn't it? You know, we all talk about new models of care without really too much of an idea of what we mean by that. I think I am concerned moving forward around it, because, you know, an awful lot of resources have gone in, understandably, over the last 18 months to ensure that care homes are stable, that they are, you know, that they are there. That's been principally from a financial point of view, in terms of things like the hardship funds. Well, they've been able to cope with the level. There hasn't been too much dialogue over the last 18 months around their role and function and what they can do. And I think, you know, the pressures that have been on care homes over the last 6 months or so to accept hospital discharges, I think that must have been very, very difficult for some of those you know, RIs and others to say no to. It must be really, really tricky. And I saw a comment, you know, in one of the fees, you know, this assumption that because someone is in a care home, they are safe, so we can prioritise our resources towards people in the community. You know, we've also been prioritising our resources into hospitals to discharge people into care homes, and perhaps not even seeing people in the community at all. So that balancing act has become more complex than it's ever been so far. We thought we were coming out of that pandemic. You know, we may well be going back into some sort of difficulties in the next couple of months. And I think it's really important that we don't lose that. Ultimately, this should be about a provider being confident enough to say that I can't meet that person's needs without there being any consequence for that individual or organisation, financially or otherwise.
Thank you. I will mention to those who are listening into this that I did chair a parliamentary review of health and social care, which was published in January 2018. And we did set out ideas based on the fantastic examples you've already got of what a new model of care might look like. And the COVID, I think, has meant that we've had to be quite innovative in managing situations. So let's hope that we can actually, as Dave said, you know, we know some of the things we need to do. This is time to seize the opportunity. I'm going to move us on. There's some sort of more professional, individual type questions. So there's a couple here. There've been lessons learned. Have lessons been learned from the inquest with the care home managers, nursing staff? And then what's the role of individual social workers in ensuring the care was being met? Was there ongoing monitoring in the care homes? And what was the involvement with families? How did all that work? So it's a huge set of questions, and key parts of that. Can you elaborate on what actually happened and who's been debriefed, if you like, and learned?
Shall I start, Chair? So this is the start, really, of we did deliberate whether this session was opened up to care homes as well, and I think that will be an ongoing conversation moving forward. But within the Gwent area and from the homes that the Health Board commissioned with, when we had our care home exec liaison group, following the when we were able to come back together virtually and following the inquest, I did do a briefing with them and went through various slides, some of which are very similar to the slides that Margaret has presented for us today, on what their you know, what our expectations are, what we need to start to do going forward. So I shared it at an RI level. I can't speak for across Wales. And then the roles of the families. Well, as you know, we met in an Iron Bevan and in local authority and CIW with some of the Operation Jasmine families, as they were called, Justice for Jasmine. And we went through, myself and some colleagues who are on this call, some very harrowing 2 or 3 days with them. And a lasting sort of legacy of what they left in our memory bank was, where were you when we needed you? And what we tried to do is explain some of the actions that we'd taken, but also listen to their views as to other things that we could do. And that has been part of our development and learning as we've gone through Operation Jasmine. The three of us were due to do a presentation with that group again, either yesterday or earlier in the year, but actually that's now been postponed until January, I believe, and I'll be leaving that to Dave and Margaret to do, and somebody else from this organisation will be joining them. But so we've not lost sight of the families, and they, for some of us, probably had less questions when we were in court answering the coroner than for the people like the homeowners and the Home Chief Executive, Mr. Black.
Yeah, thank you. Any observation, maybe Dave, around the involvement of individual social workers? Can't hear you, Dave.
Thank you, Ruth. There's nothing new for social workers in terms of their responsibilities in this area, and if you go back and look at what was going on, there were all sorts of concerns being raised by all sorts of different people. Unfortunately, all those concerns went into different parts of the system and were never brought together, and I think that has been the focus for us, certainly in Gofal, in making sure that those social work concerns are considered in one place and are just as valid as anyone else's concern. And I think we would apply that to the concerns of family members as well. But what we had at the time was a very disparate structure where everyone had their own information and everyone had their own knowledge and concerns, but there was nowhere really that people could bring that where you could see, well, hang on a second, you might have got one high-level concern over here, but over here you've got 6 different low-level concerns, and we were blind to that, and that's certainly what the emphasis has been on, is drawing that together in terms of one message for the organisation. Yeah.
So big picture, stand back, collate all the information and really triangulate it together. Really important. Right, I'm going to move on. Is there a plan on a national scale to review escalating concerns? Where does this sit? Margaret, maybe?
Well, I'm not actually sure now, but I know there was talk about it, Ruth. There was talk about reviewing the escalated concerns process, and we were very pleased to hear that, because I think it is time for it to be reviewed. I'm going to be honest and say I'm not quite sure where that is at this moment in time. It may be that COVID has got in the way, but I'm happy to go back and try and find out where it's at. In fact, I've actually already emailed someone in Welsh Government to ask them, is there any plan to pick that work back up? I think it was started and there was some work done somewhere, but I'm not sure it was taken forward.
I think someone's just put in the chat that North Wales are reviewing escalating concerns.
Okay.
But what an opportunity for peer learning, peer review of each other, shared learning. Don't wait for national grand reviews. Sometimes you can do it between health boards and local authorities. But anyway,
can I just back in on that one, because I think every time we've gone through escalating concerns, or indeed a home closure, sadly, which we do get, we've reviewed with our partner local authority how we've managed that process and used that to inform our local process. And Margaret's right, we did do some work pre-COVID. I can't remember who was leading on it, and I think we've lost sight of the bigger picture. So just to clarify, thank you.
Thank you, great. Right, does CIW feel there's been an improvement with the accountability moving to RIs? Experience of some very challenging situations during COVID is a mixed bag, and some RIs are still very distanced from the service, both geographically and knowledge basis.
I think I would agree it is a mixed bag, because the new role of RIs, it does two things. It places these accountabilities on them, but it also requires that person to be at a very, very senior level in the organisation. And the impact of that is that some of those people that put themselves forward for RIs because they have to, haven't quite understood what that really means for them as a person in terms of what their responsibility is. So I'd be the first to admit that, in the same way as I talked about the care standards that coming in, and there was a period of time of learning and embedding that.
There's feedback.
I think it's feedback because some people got their microphones
yes
on. on.
Okay, we're
still. I mean, RISCA, although RISCA came in 2016, it wasn't enforced, and it didn't come into force until 2018. We then had the pandemic, and I think that we made good progress with RIs. I think the pandemic has probably brought us back a few steps, because we had then people doing virtual visits. I saw someone commenting on that, and I agree they should be in person. So for us as an inspectorate, doing something around RIs, with RIs, to make them understand their responsibilities is a piece of work that we want to take forward. So I suppose I'm agreeing with the person. I do think it's a mixed bag, and there's more work needed in that area.
Okay, thank you. Conscious we've got 10 minutes left. There's lots of questions coming in and comments. Apparently, the Welsh Government commissioned a Swansea University review of escalating concerns in 2010, but pandemic has interrupted that work. I'm not sure if it's 2010 or 2020, but
I think it was early 2020, Ruth.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So there is some work, as Margaret said, that needs to be recovered. We should never shy away from challenging providers when they fall short. I think that's the balance. The system can be the system, but it's about when you personally take responsibility to do something about it, and that's a difficult decision. Following on from our learning during COVID, where at times statutory frameworks seemed ill-equipped to respond to the unfolding crisis, will there be a review of current arrangements, guidance and legislation if necessary?
So the statutory framework certainly at the time was ill-equipped, but you've got to remember we now have a new statutory framework, and that is the Social Service and Wellbeing Wales Act and the Regulation and Inspection of Social Care Wales Act, and they're still relatively in their infancy. I know people might say, well, you know, social care services is 2014, but RISCA was only implemented in 2018, and we had to re-register all those services. So that new legislative framework is definitely better. As a regulator, I can say that I'm confident it is much better and gives us much better tools to deal with these situations. But it all comes down to us as professionals making decisions and making difficult decisions. That legislation is never going to take that away from us.
Absolutely. And again, a reflection on the last 18 months and finding things, because inspection hasn't been carried out in the same way, finding things that are worrying. Now is a good time to examine the way we monitor. And using the Flynn report talked about circles of quality to highlight early indicators of concern. So I think lots of time to reflect, but as you say, Margaret, the system is relatively new. So it's whether we can use the system we have better, learning from COVID and the situation facing health and social care at the moment.
I think, Ruth, on that point that I said earlier on, there's more to be done in terms of sharing information and working together. We know that we at various points in the pandemic, we weren't able to inspect as much, and maybe indeed local authorities weren't able to monitor as much. But we can, if we work together, and I do think that we need to do more in that area, we can get much bigger bang for our buck, and we could share information more freely with each other.
Yeah. Do you feel, you may not want to answer this one, do you feel there's an argument to develop state-run nursing homes?
Well,
some of us have been around a long time, and I don't think the state did particularly well when we ran them. As Margaret and Dave have both alluded to, we do have some very, very good providers, and we mustn't lose sight that everything is, in the situation that we were presented with at court and the atrocities of Operation Jasmine. And care in any setting has to be led, and any ward setting can be brilliant with a team and then can change, as can a dental practice, a GP practice. It's variable to the people that are there.
Yeah.
I suppose I'd take a slightly different view to that, which I think I'm allowed to do. I think if you look at residential care homes, what we've got there is a sort of mix of provision between the independent sector and the public sector. A view perhaps that has gone too far towards the private sector. That's a view some people hold. I think there's a little bit of room in there. Why can't the public sector run registered nursing homes? I'm not saying they should run them all. I'm not saying that at all. But I don't really understand why we would want to be excluded from that. At a real challenges and risks to doing it, and I can understand why perhaps like health board colleagues would run a mile at the concept, but I don't think it's something that should be ruled out.
I agree with Dave. I think it shouldn't be ruled out, but in terms of should they all be state run, what I would say is that we find really good care by private providers and really good care provided by local authorities and health boards, and we equally find some poor care from both. So being state run doesn't automatically equate to good quality. I hate to say that, but I think it's true.
Comes back to culture and leadership,
Yeah.
I suspect. So a few comments here, that meeting needs is considered by our complex care quality assurance panel. More about communication when pushing for hospital discharges, understanding the role of RIs and registered managers. Comment they want to use the D2RA model to get people assessed when in the home rather than in hospital. So providers are sharing some of that risk. So question about the police here. How do we improve the police and court response to proven abuse? Sentencing does not seem to reflect that we value older adults or people with learning disabilities. I think reflection that Dave said at the beginning that Caerphilly was focused on child protection. Any observations you want to make about that point?
I mean, I'll be slightly controversial in this, I suppose. I don't think it has moved on significantly. I think it is a societal issue. I think if Operation Jasmine had involved services for children, it certainly wouldn't have dragged on for 15, 16 years before it was brought to a conclusion. And certainly, you only got to see the very understandable and correct reaction to the awful events in Birmingham. That wouldn't have been the same if it'd been an 85-year-old older person, sadly. That's not anyone's fault. It's just how society has evolved and that sort of protection of children and perhaps not viewing vulnerable elderly people to the same degree.
Yeah, thank you. There's a request for seeing examples of data sets used for nursing homes. I'm hoping after this we'll go through all the comments and anything where we can give participants data or information. I'm sure the team will follow that up. So hopefully that'll happen. Specific question, what happened to Paul Black? Were there any consequences?
Well, Paul Black wasn't actually prosecuted, and I'm not totally sure why that was, if I'm honest. He did appear at the inquest and was given a bit of a hard time when he was there, quite rightly in my view. But yes, he wasn't prosecuted, and I don't understand why that was. I'm sure there was a reason for it, but I don't know what it is.
Okay, thank you. So there's a bit of discussion about data about nursing homes, which we'll pick up afterwards. Comments, agreeing with some of your comments, Dave, and supporting the idea of a mixed economy. Just seeing if we've got any more specific questions. Lots of reflections on what people have heard today. Yeah, don't think there's anything else that we haven't picked up. We'll just double check. We have 3 minutes left, so I'll give you notice. I might go to each one of you for 1 minute final conclusions on what you've heard today, the questions you've heard, and anything you want as a takeaway message. So just check, is there anything else that we haven't really picked up?
I would like to pick up on around the discharges to care homes from, being an NHS senior nurse. I often have to challenge my hospital senior nurses, equivalent levels, and ward staff around their expectations and managing the expectations of what care homes, particularly those with nursing, can actually deliver on. People do not realise that they're looking after some of the most vulnerable, and it's Hayley and Matthew that have been putting things in the chat bar. I'll be seeing them later because they're in my team. But they have an expectation that a care home can manage anything, push somebody out through the door of the hospital. That is not true, and often we have to work with the care homes to equip them with some new skills, and that takes time. If we don't do that, then we fail to make sure that it's a safe service for those vulnerable and complex individuals. And I cannot stress that enough. With the pressure on detox, the one thing that has caused me concern is, following the last few months, is we are at risk of going into the very same situation that we were with Operation Jasmine, of get people out of hospital because we need to keep the front door open, actually, but we haven't got safe places to put these people either. and we are often one nurse in a nursing home with a lot of, you know, fairly young and at times inexperienced carers. There is a difference out there, and some leaders can cope with it and some can't. So we almost need to embark on an education scenario setting with our colleagues in hospitals. Timing to do that, that's a difficult issue.
It is, but a real opportunity to encourage people listening to this to sort of seek help and talk through where your thresholds are, you know, and make sure you haven't got stuck in the moment and aren't able to stand back and go, is this good enough? And do I need to do something? And you're not alone, I think is important to take away from this. Talk to others about it. So we have literally a minute left and lots of supporting comments coming in there. So Dave, over to you. Final thought, takeaway message, and I'll finish with Margaret.
I think takeaway message, I mean, one of the few positives over the last 18 months has been a light shone on care homes. People have understood what care homes have done in their community and the sort of sacrifices the staff have made. Their situation in terms of the future is still very vulnerable. What we can't do is let any of those things detract us from the fact that fundamentally there are very vulnerable people in their care, and quite frankly they need to be supported, they need to be resourced properly, but actually they also need to be held to account if things are not going well. So we can't let a pandemic get in the way of the lessons that we've learned through this very sorry tale.
Thank you. Margaret.
Thanks, Ruth, I mean, I totally agree with what Dave and Claire have said. I mean, I think the final remarks for me is in order to achieve what Dave's just talked about, I really do think it's important that we all do more and keep going on our journey of working well together to share the information that we've got. And then I think finally it's about that question of culture. I think it's sort of talking about what you were talking about earlier on, Ruth, about, you know, thinking about your decisions and where you're at in your thresholds. I think we should be constantly thinking about the cultures that we're seeing out there and also our own cultures, because I keep going back to the point that it was the culture that allowed this to happen, not just the culture in the care homes, but our cultures too.
Thank you. I hope that's been useful to everyone who's participated. Thank you so much for all your reflections and comments. And there's more coming in. I know we'll pick them all up and reflect on what you've said. Been thrilled to see how much participation there's been. And finally, thank you so much to all of you, and particularly to the support team who've orchestrated all of this, and to our three panelists, Margaret, Claire and Dave. Thank you so much indeed. And that's it. Thank you.
Sorry, but I run